All right, so we're going to get into the mayor's affordable housing plan, but first we thought we'd set you up with a little bit of a context for the thing. It's the housing plan, 5 boroughs for the next 10 years. Our first slide here, we're going to be talking about New York is a renter's market. Renters make up 2/3 of the roughly 3 million households in New York City. That's a whole lot of renters. And in Brooklyn, the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment at the end of last year was just below $3,000 at $28.98. That doesn't include utilities, if you were wondering, by the way. And then 42% of renters in New York City are rent burdened, meaning that they pay about 30% worth of their income towards their housing. And of that number, half of those folks who are rent burdened have been considered severely rent burdened, meaning that they pay 50% of their income. Yes, that is half of their income goes towards just paying the rent. Moving on. Looking at de Blasio's housing plan was laid out a 10-year timeline to build or preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing, and that's going to be to the tune of about $41 billion. So right now we're just sort of at the beginning of that thing, and the housing plan is moving along. To the third, we'll show you just how much progress they're making. So far, 40,000 apartments have been financed since the mayor took office. And just recently, the mayor doubled the budget for the Housing Preservation Development Department here in New York to about $7.5 billion and kicked in another $1 billion for infrastructure for growing neighborhoods, things like parks and paving and schools and all those things that make neighborhoods livable. And at the end of 2015, about 21,000 units had been financed to some tune of about $600 million. So to sum it all up, the de Blasio plan is going to be about 10 years worth. There's an ambitious goal there, and he's running into a little bit of resistance right now, the least of which came from community boards. But since the mayor unveiled his affordable housing plan in the spring of 2014, to much fanfare, it's come under much scrutiny and may very well be on its last leg. Or is it? Danielle Tcholakian, a reporter from DNAInfo New York, has been on the story. Thanks for being here, Danielle.
Thank you.
And our friend Ben Max is also back. You may remember that Ben is the executive editor at the Gotham Gazette. Thank you for being here again, Ben. So the community boards at the first blush said, okay, we're not really for this. And it was sort of routinely trounced at that level, although it was sort of an advisory thing. They don't really have a supervisory role. They just get to kick in. But has the tune changed at all?
Well, Danielle's a community board expert, so I'll let her fill everything in
why
on
are you taking up her time?
Well, but I wanted to sort of frame things first. One of the key things here that I think a lot of people aren't understanding, and you guys have a great presentation of it, is that this affordable housing plan is really vast. And the thing that's been going in front of the community boards recently are these zoning changes to the citywide zoning code that are key to the plan, but they're not all of the plan.
Okay.
And so I think that sometimes people are mistaken right now when they see some of the news or make some assumptions that what's happening now is the whole plan, and it's not.
It's really the first.
They're talking about changing the zoning rules around the city, which are very important.
So the community boards are saying no, but to some of those points about the zoning, they are seeking variances to build buildings higher where buildings have traditionally been lower. There's some parking things that are in the mix as well. Has there been sort of an overarching theme to why community boards have been rejecting the plan?
I think the fundamental complaint is that they weren't brought in earlier in developing the plan. Community boards like to be involved in developing processes as the voice of the community, and I think they had high hopes with Mayor de Blasio as somebody who frames himself as being community-minded, right? And while it's easy to dismiss community boards as not having really any clout, which de Blasio did, they actually do have a fair amount of influence with the local council members.
All right, so looking at that sort of landscape right now, one of the things that the mayor has sort of been running into the resistance is the inclusionary zones and mandatory inclusionary zones versus inclusionary zones. Ben, give us the primer on what those are.
Well, basically, they're trying to push through for the first time mandatory inclusionary housing, which means that if you're a developer and you want to change a plot of land to build housing, you have to include affordable units with new market rate units. And that hasn't been done before, and it's being praised quite a bit, especially in concept. Some of the issue where the community boards and many city council members have pushed back is, what are the levels of affordability on those apartments that are deemed affordable, and how deep do they go to people making lower incomes in the city, who again are the people that de Blasio came into office championing?
So one of the things that is used to sort of come up with these numbers is this AMI number. And God, last year we sort of did a whole segment on AMIs and what truly neighborhood people make without factoring in this whole Westchester County and things that throw off the numbers. So looking at these AMIs, there's a building across the street that's sort of, they're saying, you know, if you make between $26,000 and $200,000, we can have a subsidized apartment for you. How are these AMIs rolling out over the various boroughs?
In mandatory inclusionary housing, the lowest target AMI that they're using is an average of 60%. A lot of people are saying that it needs to go as low as 30%, especially in lower income neighborhoods where there's a fear that people will be pushed out. Vicky Bean at a recent council hearing made a point of highlighting the word average and trying to say, you know, when we set the average at 60%, that means that a developer could do some apartments at 40% and some at 80%.
Right. So you get that income diversity in the unit. Right.
The whole idea being inclusionary means multiple levels of income.
So giving everybody a break, not just the lowest of the low, is the sort of prevailing thought from Vicky Bean there.
Right, and also using higher income people essentially to subsidize lower income people.
So Ben, earlier you spoke about the sort of community involvement and folks wanting to be in and felt like they had sort of been shut out. But Council Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito did a thing in her district where people have really been on it. And they have this sort of ambitious vision and plan for how they want their community in East Harlem, which is pretty far down the line as far as the development plan. East New York is sort of the first blush. But what did those folks do up in East Harlem?
Yeah, we just did a story about this because they're supposed to release their proposal this week, and who knows, you know, if it'll actually come out this week, it could be next week. But in East Harlem, they wanted to get out ahead of this community planning process. So they did their own thing under the direction of the speaker and other community stakeholders, and they are on the verge of releasing a plan that says, if you're going to rezone this neighborhood, we want to make sure that there's plans for not only affordable housing, but job training at NYCHA, schools, transportation, the whole thing that a community plan would entail. And that's another piece of this big housing plan that, again, is getting a little bit missed right now because we're so focused on these zoning changes. Right. These zoning changes are for the whole city. Then the city comes in with these neighborhood by neighborhood plans. East New York, you mentioned, is the first. Very controversial. They did not have a community planning process ahead of the administration's process. So East Harlem was trying to learn from that experience and get out ahead of it.
Right. They wanted to be proactive instead of reactionary, I believe the council speaker said. So
it helps to have the council speaker as your local council member.
It ain't bad to have the speaker. But it's not all bad because the AARP 1199 SEIU, they've come out for this plan, and I know you just had a great story recently about seniors really advocating for their part in this plan in housing.
Right, well, so the plan that is most beneficial to seniors is zoning for quality and affordability. And that
ZQA. That you might have heard about in this alphabet soup.
Exactly. And that is meant to change the physical requirements for construction in order to make it more possible to build senior housing. So in a lot of places that means increasing the height of buildings so that the buildings can have elevators because seniors need elevators. Right. And so the AARP is obviously very much in favor of this. Now, the council right now has its chance to make changes to the plan, and a lot of what they indicated at a recent hearing was that they wanted to add in community board review or a board of...
With buildings getting higher, there were some people who were concerned about the sort of bedroom quality of their communities and not have this
they refer to it as
upzoning.
neighborhood character.
Right. Neighborhood character, yes, that's the code word. So there was also some back and forth about the 30-year plan where these senior homes would sort of be locked in for 30 years, but then the deputy mayor saying, but we're going to be very tough with them to make sure after those 30 years that it's going to be in their best interest. So is anyone biting on that?
Well, I believe she said we are going to fight like a wildcat, not to let them out of our program. So the way she plans on doing that is to say, you know, you only have to make this unit affordable for 30 years, but when 30 years is over, you still can't use it for anything but senior housing. So essentially, come 29 years, the city's going to come to the developer and say, hey, time to re-up in our program, and the developer can't really say no in Vicky Bean's eyes, because what else are they going to use? They're not going to leave the unit empty, she says.
Yeah.
And there's not a huge market, right, for luxury, you know, high market rate senior housing.
Yeah.
You know, so they're trying to hedge their bets there, but they also, you know, they say that legally they can't, they're under certain constraints, and some of that is being investigated and looked into, I think. But, you know, these plans are, by most accounts, if not all, you know, fairly revolutionary and some of the strongest in the country, so there's not necessarily a lot of precedent for people to look around at.
Yeah, so why is this becoming noisy now? If we had the announcement back in 2014, a lot of people who don't live in East New York or on the front lines may have sort of let it recede to the back of their minds. Why is it coming forward now, you think, Ben?
Well, this is where the planning process and the ULURP process, the land use review process, is now going forward with the two citywide zoning changes, the MIH and the ZQA, which we've gone through a bit. Yeah. So that's why it's really come to the fore, is that it went through the community boards who had a lot of concerns. It went through the borough boards. Now it's going through the council. And so that, you know, these two zoning changes are front and center, not to mention other aspects of the housing plan, including the 421A tax program that the city relies on from Albany to allow developers to be free of property taxes for many years for other affordable housing units.
Right. So who's standing with the mayor on this? We've just heard a lot of voices aside from some seniors maybe on the other side. Who can he count on in his column?
Well, some of his allies actually recently formed a 501c4, I believe it's called, which is essentially like a super PAC, where they can raise money without having to account for where the money comes from and how much money they have, in order to further his goals. I think it's under Affordable NYC is what they've named themselves.
So when we start seeing the commercials on the Affordable NYC, pay for this message.
You know, it's been pretty telling that from the beginning, the real estate industry has been behind these plans. And that has raised a lot of eyebrows and some red flags for people, because they say, well, if real estate developers are gung-ho about this,
it's got to be bad for
maybe
New York.
It's not exactly so community-minded. And so just first blush right there, it's almost as if the administration has wanted to sort of quiet that support a little bit, because it looks bad for them if they are saying this is about affordability. Exactly. So that's part of who's in the mayor's corner. We should say that virtually every city council member is behind the mandatory inclusionary housing program. It's just a matter of what are the levels of affordability that are mandated in those apartments. And that's where the council now is going to tweak the proposal in the next month, 6 weeks, and come back with what they are going to push through. And the way this land use review process goes is whatever the council pushes through, the mayor either cannot accept it or it goes through. He doesn't get another swipe at changes.
Back to the drawing board with it. So Danielle, you have been involved with the community boards intimately. You're out there. What's the feeling there? Do you think folks in the neighborhood feel that housing is coming for them, or we're going to be pushed out, specifically in the East New York context? Do they think finally my kids will get their own apartment and we can all stop living together, or no, it's
seem to have a
spreading.
little bit of an answer in mind. I
I'm
think.
just asking. This is something like I was reading all this stuff last night, and I'm thinking, because if you look at the AMI and the levels, and some of them seem very low for certain developments, and you say, wow, who lives in the city currently and is making that amount of money and able to sustain themselves? And to me, it seems just like a kid who does live with his mom and just needs to get his own space. So who do they think these apartments are for in the community?
Well, I mean, there's this group, New Yorkers for Real Affordability, is that it?
I've seen their posters.
Yeah, so
Those names are all fairly interchangeable.
Yeah,
There's
yeah,
some
there's
for,
like-
some against.
They've got some great posters on Atlantic Avenue that I was
Right.
rolling by.
So they had somebody who put out, I think it was an editorial recently, saying that she lives in Bushwick and she lives with her children and her sister and her husband, and they subsist on her husband's income, bagging groceries, and he made something like it was less than $20,000 a year. And so, you know, for them, they say there's a lot of people like that.
Right.
The East New York thing is interesting today, actually, because just this morning I noticed in the city record, the city just released their final environmental impact statement on East New York, which is essentially where they say, like, here's the bad things our plan might do.
Right.
When they did that for the citywide zoning, they essentially came away with our plan won't
It's
do
all
anything
good,
bad.
yeah.
It was like we might make some noise when we're building things. But one of the things they were called out on was saying this won't increase development, this won't increase density, which a lot of urban planners said that's a
That's the
crazy
point.
thing to, right, by definition, your
Yeah.
plan is supposed to do that. So I actually haven't had a chance to look through the document yet, but
So it's almost
It's on
a
the city
scoop. You have
record.
to
Yeah.
back it.
Or anyone
And
can go find it.
Let her digest the city record, then you can read on DNA.
I think, you know, what you're getting at is this fear of gentrification, this fear of displacement that a lot of people have. Now, some people wonder, well, if I'm in East New York, where do I go from there?
Yeah.
I mean, there's almost nowhere else in the city to go
Right.
where. So
It's the last frontier.
And you know, the administration's argument in response is that nobody's coming into East New York right now to build luxury apartments.
Right.
Anything that goes there is going to be built at moderate and low income levels. And that HPD, because you showed the billions of
$7.5
dollars
billion.
in, that is money they say that's separate from MIH and new developer.
Just to keep HPD up and running and doing all the things they're doing.
Well, that's and some of what they're doing is
Mm-hmm.
they're financing through developers that are not for-profit developers, not-for-profit
Yeah, like the
developers.
Fifth Avenue committees of the world.
Exactly, and then so they point out, they say that for places like East New York, they're coming in with more density, but a lot of it is going to be at the deeper levels of affordability.
Yeah.
That's their argument.
Well,
we have to see that actually.
We'll keep
happen.
reading Gotham, Gazette, and DNAInfo to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Thank you both for being here. We
Thank you.
definitely appreciate it, and we'll be watching.